Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video.
So you've brought us a really heavy topic for this deep dive, Japan's Unit 731. I mean, wow, this one, I gotta say, I did my homework, I read up on it, but honestly, the more I read, especially about, accusations of them using biological weapons, especially the 1941 plague outbreak in Changteh, China, I just kept thinking, hold on, did this really happen?
Yeah, it's one of those stories, shrouded in so much mystery, a lot of shadows, unanswered questions. But even those unanswered questions, right?
Yeah.
They force us to think about some really disturbing possibilities.
For sure. So, okay, let's unpack this carefully.
Okay.
For our listeners who might not be familiar, can you give us that high-level overview of Unit 731?
Sure. So Unit 731, basically they were this covert branch of the Imperial Japanese Army operating in the 1930s and 40s. And their mission, if you can even call it that, was developing biological weapons.
Okay.
And not just, researching these things in a lab, but actually testing them on human subjects.
So we're talking about some of the most, just absolute deadliest pathogens out there.
Absolutely.
Was there, a method to their madness? Was there a strategic rationale behind why they chose what they did?
Well, you have to try to understand the historical context here. This is a Japan that's in the grip of militarism, right? They have these expansionist ambitions and this belief in their own superiority. Biowarfare, to them, probably seemed like the ultimate weapon, the cutting edge of power.
So you're saying this wasn't just some, rogue operation. Their work was, a product of Japan's overall, ambition at the time.
It was very much woven into the fabric of their ideology.
That's disturbing.
Yeah.
Okay, but they weren't content to just develop these weapons, were they? Because what we're looking at, according to the sources you've provided, suggests they actually deployed them.
And that's where Changteh comes into the picture.
Okay.
So picture this. 1941, China, right in the thick of the war. Changteh, this bustling city, it's suddenly struck by this mysterious and very fast-spreading illness. And we're not just talking about any illness. We're talking about bubonic plague, one of the biggest killers in human history.
See, no, that's what I'm curious about. The plague. I mean, most people today, they only know it from history books, right?
Yeah.
So break it down for us. Why was it so terrifying back then?
Okay, so today we have antibiotics, right? They target bacteria. Revolutionized medicine. But back in 1941, cutting-edge science, this was a death sentence. The plague is spread by fleas that carry this bacteria, Yersinia pestis, and it just ripped through populations with horrifying speed. The symptoms alone, fever, chills, and then these excruciatingly painful swollen lymph nodes. They're called buboes. That's where it gets its name. I mean, it seemed like something out of a nightmare.
And in Changteh, this outbreak happened suspiciously soon after Japanese planes were seen over the city.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about sightings. We have accounts of these planes dropping strange materials, things like grain, cotton, wadding.
Grain? What are they doing dropping grain on a city?
Right. It seems odd, doesn't it?
Okay, so we've got Japanese planes. They're flying over Changteh, and then boom, this devastating plague outbreak. I mean, it sounds like, I don't know, almost too convenient, like something out of a history book. But you're saying there's evidence to suggest it wasn't just a coincidence.
Right. And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating and honestly really disturbing. Because proving a direct link, definitively saying Unit 731 caused the Changteh outbreak, it's difficult. And that's largely because the unit, they destroyed most of their records at the end of the war.
Oh, so they were covering their tracks.
A deliberate cover-up, many historians believe. So we're left piecing together the puzzle with what remains.
Okay, so even without that, smoking gun, so to speak, what does the rest of the evidence tell us? I mean, you mentioned grain, cotton wadding. What's the deal with that? How could that even spread the plague?
So these eyewitness accounts, and some of the most compelling ones, come from missionaries who were stationed in Changteh at the time.
Okay.
They describe these planes dropping grain and cotton wadding. Now, at first glance...
It sounds harmless.
Exactly. You think, okay, what are they going to do with that? But remember those fleas we talked about?
The ones that carry the plague.
Exactly. Fleas can live in materials like grain, like cotton. It's entirely possible that this grain, this cotton, was deliberately contaminated with plague-infected fleas.
So they were basically, weaponizing everyday materials?
Precisely. And this wasn't some random tactic they just came up with either. We know from other sources that Unit 731, they were experimenting with all sorts of different delivery methods for their biological weapons.
Wow.
Specifically, something called aerial dissemination, basically figuring out how to release these pathogens from the air to maximize their spread. They even had a dedicated Air Force unit for these types of operations.
So they had the means, they had the opportunity, and if their goal was to, I don't know, cripple a key city that was resisting their advance,
Right.
they certainly had a motive. But you mentioned earlier that some historians, they remain skeptical. What are their arguments? What's their case?
So some historians, they'll point out that, yeah, the timing of this outbreak right after Japanese planes are seen, it's definitely suspicious, right? But correlation doesn't equal causation.
Just because something happens after something else doesn't mean the first thing caused it.
Exactly. There could be other explanations for a plague outbreak, right? Natural causes. Maybe even an accidental release of the plague from somewhere else.
Yeah.
It's true, proving this case definitively would require more concrete evidence, and unfortunately with the records destroyed, we're relying on piecing together a lot of circumstantial evidence, which can be open to interpretation.
Right, like you said before, lots of shadows, unanswered questions.
Right.
What about those missionary accounts you mentioned? I'm curious, in their letters, did they put two and two together at the time? Did they make that connection?
Their writings from that period, they really capture the confusion, the fear as people started getting sick, you know?
Yeah.
They knew something was wrong, and they definitely suspected the Japanese activity was connected. And while they might not have had the full scientific understanding of what Unit 731 was really up to.
Right. Nobody did at that point.
Exactly. But those firsthand accounts, they're still crucial pieces of the puzzle. These were people who lived through it, saw the planes with their own eyes, experienced the horror of the outbreak firsthand.
And those firsthand perspectives, those are so valuable, especially in situations like this where hard evidence is so hard to come by. But it still feels like even with all of this, it's a case built on circumstances, on connecting the dots. What would it take to truly I don't know, satisfy the skeptics? Is there some piece of evidence that could be out there that would blow this whole case wide open?
Well, imagine if we found, say, a hidden diary of Unit 731 scientists,
Oh.
or a cache of recently declassified government documents.
Okay.
You know, something with a direct order authorizing the attack.
Right.
A logbook detailing the preparation of plague-infected materials.
Wow.
Those would be game changers.
It would be incredible, almost like something out of a movie.
Right.
But even if we never find that definitive, irrefutable proof, it just feels, I don't know, irresponsible to just ignore the possibility that this happened. Because what happened in Changteh, if it was a deliberate attack, I mean, it has implications far beyond just that one event.
Yeah, and it gets you thinking, right? This isn't just some, I don't know, forgotten footnote in a history book. If this really was a deliberate biological attack,
Right.
I mean, it has some pretty chilling implications for us, even today.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, are we any safer from these kinds of threats now than they were back then? That's the unsettling question, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, the world has, of course, condemned biological warfare.
Right.
But at the same time, the technology to actually engineer these deadly pathogens, it's only gotten more advanced since World War II. So yeah, the threat is unfortunately still very real, whether it's from, rogue states or even terrorist groups.
So the story of Unit 731, it's a stark warning from history, a reminder that, this stuff can happen, that scientific knowledge in the wrong hands.
Absolutely. It's a reminder of what happens when you have this kind of unchecked ambition, the potential for just human cruelty on a massive scale. And it really highlights why international cooperation is so important, why we need to be vigilant about preventing these kinds of atrocities from happening again.
It's funny, reading about all of this, something else came to mind. I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's been this whole debate about using the data that was collected from Unit 731's experiments.
Oh, right.
Even if it means potentially, medical advancements.
It's one of those things where it's just a moral tightrope walk,
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you've got data that was obtained through unimaginable suffering. I mean, you're talking about using human beings as lab rats, essentially.
Right. And to use it, it almost feels like, I don't know, you're somehow justifying those crimes.
Exactly. You're betraying the memory of those victims. But then on the other hand, there are those who argue that, well, if there's even a chance that this information could lead to medical advancements, to, help people who are suffering today in the future, to completely ignore it, that's also doing a disservice. So It's really tough. There are no easy answers.
It just really, makes you think about how important strong ethical guidelines are for scientific research, right? Especially when you're dealing with something as potentially devastating as biowarfare.
Absolutely. And I think the legacy of Unit 731 should serve as a constant reminder of that responsibility, right? We have to learn from these dark chapters and actually do something with that knowledge so that something like this never happens again.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. I mean, we're talking disturbing history, scientific ethics, global security threats. But as we wrap up here, I gotta say, my thoughts keep going back to the people of Changteh. I mean, if this was a deliberate attack, they were victims of, a horrific war crime.
And that's exactly why it's so important to keep talking about it, to keep investigating. Those stories, even the really, really dark ones, they deserve to be brought into the light. And not just to, honor the victims, but to remind all of us that we have a role to play in preventing this from ever happening again.
Uncovering the truth, however painful it might be, that's always the first step. This has been, I gotta say, a tough one, but incredibly important. And we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the Changteh outbreak? Head over to our website, check out the source materials we've linked, and let's keep this conversation going because history, well, it's not just something we read about in a book, it's something we can learn from and hopefully something we can prevent from ever happening again.